All right, so in this lecture, we're going to cover basically the basics of how expensive medical school is and to kind of put everything into perspective. Based on some of the recent data, obviously, if you're a pharmacy student, you're going to have a lot of debt. More than likely, you're going to have the average debt for most pharmacy students is around $163,000 in student loans. And there's more expenses associated with, obviously, tuition of medical school, especially with additional costs of a medical school application cycle. So we'll cover some of the details specifically related to how expensive the application cycle is itself. So there's this good resource I'd like to recommend up front because I think this process it needs to be individualized based on how healthy your application is, in other words, how competitive you are, because if you're more competitive, you might have to apply to less programs and you'll have less travel expenses because you'll get into medical schools earlier and you don't have to shop around as much. Versus if you're more of a borderline applicant, you might have more costs down the line as well. So those are things that I think you need to kind of consider, and I think this tool, the Medical School Application Cycle Cost Estimator, and here's the QR code, is a good resource to utilize. So I made this little chart here for you to kind of realize how expensive applying to medical school really is. So I've kind of stratified it into three different pathways, like the minimalist, the average student, and then if you got a lot of cash to throw, then house in the Hamptons, that might be an option for you. Sometimes you're kind of stuck and you might have to apply to more programs. There's not like a perfect example. I will say initially I was trying to take the minimalist route. I'm very financially attentive, so I don't like to spend a lot of money on things, and I can imagine people with a lot of pharmacy loan debt like myself are similar in that mindset. But you have to sit down and think to yourself, what do I really want to do? Do I really want to kind of skimp by and be stressed with applying to medical school and not apply as robustly as I should have, and then face the fear of potentially not getting in and having to repeat the cycle? So those things you have to kind of weigh and balance out to make sure that are you being too cheap or are you, blowing out the budget? So let's take a look real quick and we can talk about some things here. So MCAT cost, you're kind of stuck with that. There's not much you can do or to avoid that. There are different penalties where if you sign up at different time points, so the further you sign up out from your actual test date, the cheaper it should be. The price I know goes up as you get closer and closer. Let's say you want to schedule like 5 days in advance or something along those lines. Well, that's going to cost you a lot more than if you get set up and got your reservation 3 months ahead of time. And there's different tiers like gold, bronze, and silver that you should look into. But generally speaking, it's about $320, give or take a few dollars. I know they uptrend in cost every single year. So additionally, Casper exam, that is like the Alta suite. That's the ethics exam that we've talked about so far. Not every program will require you to utilize Casper or Alta Suite, so it has to be fine-tuned and adjusted. But that gives you a rough estimate of how many programs and how much it'll cost. And a lot of this is defined on how many programs you actually apply to. And like I said, that's tied to how competitive you are as an individual. So back to my story about being a minimalist, I ended up taking the MCAT twice. And the reason for that is because the first time around, I utilized the minimalist perspective of free resources only and a bunch of AAMC content that is pretty much necessary. I think you need to use it. But that is, I basically tried to not utilize anything and spend as little money as possible because I wasn't really convinced that I was even going to be a physician someday. I was just, I'm going to try the MCAT out and see how it goes. And that's the completely wrong mindset to approach this test with. So because of that, I did terrible on it, 37th percentile, and had to repeat the MCAT, which means, added MCAT costs and more. And I ended up doing a test prep course because I was kind of stuck in that position where I was running out of time. So I think that, finding what fits you is going to be very, very important, and not to go too cheaply. Although people do survive in this minimalist position, so it's not to say that it can't be done. It's just, for me personally, I think I made a mistake by going too cheap. So you can see the rest of the information here. The cost of primary application, it says $42 there. It's actually $43 now, go figure. but everything's off by maybe like $1 or $2 here and there. So it just gives you a rough estimate. Interview travel, I think, is also important to highlight because depending on where you apply, you might be applying across the country. That's going to be very, very expensive when it comes to airfare and all of that stuff. So versus if you apply to your local community programs and stuff, within your driving vicinity. So those are important considerations to think about. There's also deposits, which can be very, very expensive. I was a victim of 2 osteopathic or DO deposits, which are unfortunately non-refundable. The first one I got into was my first program, and they were very expensive. So I ended up paying like $1,000 deposit for it, and it was very unfortunate, but I was excited, of course, because I got into medical school. I then subsequently got into another osteopathic medical school, literally like a week later after I had paid the deposit. And that school was literally 30%, or it was almost 50% cheaper than the medical school, and it was closer to home. So I was my hands were tied, and I was forced to pay another deposit. So, that's an unfortunate circumstance that you might not have to come across that can kind of really make a difference in how much money you spend. For myself, I think I spent closer to $10,000 on the medical school application cycle. So not great, but that's, I think I wasn't as savvy with my funds, and I was kind of piecing things together as they went. So this course is obviously designed to help you, show you that you can be smart with your money. So there are some options that you can utilize that can help minimize the cost of not only just applying to medical school, but also just the cost of tuition in and of itself. So the AAMC offers a fee assistance program, and that is for individuals who qualify for basically they have to have like a lower socioeconomic status, or they have to be below a certain income threshold based off of their parental income. So I don't really cover that here, but that's something that is kind of complex and needs to be addressed from the AAMC website itself. So I just recommend if you want to hear more information about that, you can just type in that exact platform and they will give you information and access to it. MD PhD is also an option, and we talk more about that in the final lectures of this course, particularly because I don't think it is a popular option, so hence why I hold it off till the very end, because most pharmacy students who are applying in non-traditionals are already a few years older than most traditional students, and so the option of doing an MD PhD and basically doubling your amount of time in medical school doesn't seem like a very attractive approach, especially when we're usually leaving our particular fields to get out of a research option. Why would we continue on with more research? So just a quick side note for MD PhDs, how it works is that you do 2 years of basically your 2 years of didactic medical school, your courseworks. Then you will enter a basically intersession phase where you'll do 3 to 4 years of PhD work. And then you go back to medical school for the final 2 years, which are your clinicals. So you basically take a giant hiatus away from medicine, and you focus on like research during that middle interim. So that turns into an 8-year process, sometimes even 9, depending on how proactive you are with your PhD. So because of that, it's a very difficult position to get into. It's very competitive because the upside is that your tuition is completely covered for the entirety of medical school. So it sounds attractive up front, but you forego 3 to 4 years of future attending salary. Hence, I don't think it's actually worth the money that you save, but we will cover that more in future lecture. And then there's also another very popular option that I get a lot of questions about because they do a lot of marketing for it. And this is the HPSP program. So anytime you get into a medical school, you will immediately be contacted about starting up with the military, or they do a lot of recruiting for HPSP. So we'll talk a little bit more about that right now, actually, because it doesn't come up again later on. So we'll cover that right now. So there are some pros to doing the HPSP, and then there are some certain cons associated with it. So you can read them off the screen here, but I'll talk a little bit more about each detail. So tuition is completely covered depending on how long you sign up for. And they have different contracts where you can sign up for, I believe, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years. You're also granted a monthly stipend, so a living expense, which is pretty convenient, so you don't have to worry about any external expenses or anything along those lines. You also get a signing bonus that's usually reserved for people who do the 4-year commitment, although you might be able to negotiate for 3 years depending on what branch of the military you're working with. You also receive higher residency pay. So most people who do the HPSP program will end up doing a military residency, and that will result in like higher pay, as high as 53% higher. But some of the cons, I think, outweigh the pros in the sense that you have actually less autonomy over choosing your specialty. So, for instance, the military needs a lot more trauma surgeons and a lot more emergency medicine physicians, and they don't really need quite a whole lot of pediatric oncologists. So, if that's a profession that you're interested in, then that might be, the options are far more limited. So you have to consider what specialties are going to be most sought after if you take the HPSP route. There's also a payback period, and residency typically doesn't count. So if you took 4 years of tuition benefits and stipend, well, then you owe 4 years back to the military. And when it comes to that, that means that they can move you around like any other, military unit. So you could be stationed in other countries, you could be stationed in places that may be less than ideal or away from family. But, that's kind of your contract that you sign up for. So just know what you're signing up for ahead of time. The downside, too, is that while you're working as an attending during that payback period, you actually make substantially lower than what civilians make. So the benefits, when I've looked at the long-term benefits and what I've heard from professionals, they come out pretty much behind, actually, financially speaking. Now, that's not to say that this is like a bad option, because there are some good things. You could travel around the world. You can get some really cool life experience. The commitment to service is obviously important as well. So there are some very clear upsides, but I think a lot of students get roped into the fact that they say, oh, it's free tuition and you get a signing bonus and all this monthly stipend. But when you look at the long-term options, you actually are losing money depending on what specialty you go into. Another important note I want to mention is this might be a better option if you are attending an extremely, extremely expensive medical school like Georgetown or something along those lines. So, tuition can range up to as high as like $100,000 with cost of living expenses and stuff, because it's a very expensive area to live. By doing so, at the end of 4 years, you are at risk of having $400,000 in loans. Well, then this option might be far better to do this and have the military cover it, because it's going to take way longer to pay off those loans. Alternatively, if you end up at like an osteopathic medical school like LECOM, that has some of the lowest tuition in the country of like $30,000, you could get away with $120,000 in loans. That doesn't really that doesn't make sense to do 4 years of covered tuition when you could realistically pay that off in 2 years of attending salary as a civilian. So those are just important things I wanted to cover here. So again, not for everyone, but something that I think you need to consider. And the best option is going to be talking to someone who's actually in this track, because you can get the real inside tips and tricks. And so that concludes this episode, and we'll continue on with the rest of the course.